Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Star Wars Battlefront 2 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at 1080p, and we are of course at the 15 watt stock TDP here. Now another thing to note is that this is running with the 22.7.1 beta drivers. Now these drivers are supposed to include improvements to DirectX 11. Whether or not they actually improve the performance in this game, I'm not 100% sure, as I did not test it before and after the driver update. But keep in mind of those drivers when you look at the performance that we're getting here. At the 15 watt TDP, at the lowest in-game graphics settings, the level of performance that we're getting here was actually surprising, because we are at a range where we're pretty much having an above 30 FPS gaming experience. And really overall, that kind of means that this is relatively playable. I would not really call this a bad experience overall, though for a shooter-based game, which can be both first person or third person, having FPS numbers that are below 60 can be a bit annoying. But if you're someone that's used to playing games like this, then this is more than enough and is well within the range that you would probably associate with something like a PS4. So overall, I'm actually really impressed and happy with how this is running at 1080p with just the stock 15 watt TDP. But we can try to improve the overall gaming experience just by raising the TDP up to 25 watts. Now, raising the TDP up to 25 watts does net us a nice little improvement, though it's nothing substantial. The 1% lows are now pretty much in the mid 30s, and our averages are in the low to mid 40s as well. So in general, a nice little improvement in the overall gaming experience, and it does make things a lot more playable. And if you look at those frame times, they are so flat. It is pretty much going to be a very smooth and consistent gaming experience. So while it's not a high refresh rate gaming experience, it is at least consistent enough that it will be doable for most people. And I think a lot of people will find this to be more than adequate for playing this game, especially if you're just someone that's playing the co-op or the single player. If you're someone that likes to play the multiplayer, maybe it's not enough for you, but I don't really think that the multiplayer in this game is hyper competitive or anything like that where you need to have a high refresh rate. But the multiplayer in this game is just something that I never really played too consistently. I think I've only played it maybe a handful of times. So in general, it just is not something that I'm too familiar with. But we can, of course, also raise the TDP up to 30 watts and see if that can actually boost us into a range that is even better than this. Now, while playing a game with the 30 watt TDP, it was mostly just running perfectly fine with the 1% lows almost getting into the 40 range, but it was in this section right here that things really started to tank and the 1% lows were dropping into the 30 range. It still was perfectly playable. I think the 1% lows being in the 30 range is more than enough to really get an enjoyable gaming experience, and our averages were in the 40 range as well. But this was a very demanding area and was essentially the most demanding section of this map. And the game was still able to keep up. Of course, the 30 watt TDP doing a lot of work here, though in general it was just a very enjoyable experience here. And it might be a situation where if you're playing at the 15 watt TDP and the 25 watt TDP, it might not be able to keep up here. So in general, 1080p depending on the map can actually end up being pretty demanding. So it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to decide on how you're going to end up playing this game. Personally, I would actually just recommend that you drop the resolution down, and we're going to go down to 900p to see how that actually performs. Now, going down to the 15 watt TDP at 900p, you can see that the level of performance here that we're getting is relatively decent. 1% lows are sticking to essentially 30, and our averages are anywhere between high 30s to low 40s depending on the section of the map that we're in. So in general, it is a playable experience, and 900p does do a bit to level out the overall frame times, though we have not seen any situation where the frame times were too brutal, but there will occasionally be moments where things will spike up. But in general, it was very playable, and of the multiple games that I played at the 15 watt TDP, it ended up being perfectly fine throughout all of it. At no point did I really feel like it was just too bad of an experience where I would not recommend playing like this if you're only able to play at the 15 watt TDP. I know there are some people out there that have systems that just will not be able to handle any more than this, or they live in regions that really end up cooking your hardware if you go anything higher than this. I know personally, if I did not have AC where I lived, I pretty much would not be able to raise the TDP, because without the AC, it would be blisteringly hot in here. Of course, the 25 watt TDP at 900p is giving us a really great result here, where 1% lows are very close to 40 and our averages are in the mid 40s. So overall, very nice, very consistent overall gaming experience. Again, nothing high refresh rate, but for a game that you're probably just going to be playing the co-op in anyway, it's more than doable. It's very enjoyable, and I think most people, if they don't have an FPS counter up, will still find an enjoyable experience overall in this game. I think if you're somebody that's used to playing games on APUs, you're probably not looking to get 60 FPS, and you're more than happy to have something in the mid 40s with 1% lows that aren't dropping down dramatically low. So really, this is overall a win in terms of performance. Now at the 30-watt TDP, we actually end up seeing performance that is really good at this point. Our averages are very close to 60, and our 1% lows are in the high to mid 40s. So overall, really nice gaming experience. Really, it is going to be very map dependent, but even in the most demanding maps, you're not going to have 1% lows that drop below 40 most of the time. Sometimes it'll maybe go into the like 39, 38, but it has to be in the really demanding areas with a lot of action happening. And in general, this was the level of performance that I was seeing in most of the maps that I played. So in general, very nice levels of performance. I was very happy with this. And if you're on a system that can actually go all the way to the 30-watt TDP without getting into dangerous temperatures, you're going to have a nice gaming experience. Though if you look at the temperatures that I'm at, it is at levels that I find to be uncomfortable, both in the level of noise that it makes and also the fact that the keys on the actual laptop get very hot, and it just in general is putting hardware at risk for no real reason. It is nice levels of performance, but it's not enough to really say that this is going to make a huge life-changing difference in terms of the overall playability of the game. You're kind of just risking things for no real tangible benefit. But of course, we can drop things down even further by going down to 720p. Now at 720p, the level of performance that we're getting here is actually really impressive, because we're back down to the 15-watt TDP, and we're in an area with a lot of action, a lot of shooting was going on here, pretty intense levels of action, and the 1% lows still did not drop below 30. So in general, for something that is just the stock 15-watt TDP, this is really impressive levels of performance, because we're getting averages that are pretty much near 60 and 1% lows that are at worst going to drop down into the low 30 range, but it's still going to be perfectly playable, and you're going to have a really great time like this. I think if you just don't have an FPS counter up, you're probably going to have a really good time, even in the most intense moments in this game, because you'll see moments with a lot of projectiles, a lot of enemies fighting, everything clustered together, a lot of explosions. Everything is still keeping up perfectly fine. So in general, 720p at the stock 15-watt TDP is a really impressive result, but we can see what raising the TDP past this is actually going to net us in terms of performance. And this is when we're starting to see the first real result of some high refresh rate gaming with averages that are finally above 60. So not exactly high refresh rate, but it is above the 60 hertz panel that is in this laptop. And with 1% lows that are pretty much at 60, it means that we're getting a rock solid experience. Now it is very map dependent though, but in general, the 1% lows are never going to drop below 50 most of the time. At the lowest that I saw was 45, and that was just in one small little instance. So the results are just great in general, and I was really happy with the level of performance going on here, and I had a lot of fun playing like this. This was the smoothest that it felt. And honestly, I think that the gameplay of this game lends itself well to this lower resolution, because it's not a game where you need to be ultra precise and you're shooting at targets that are very hard to see or anything like that. It is very forgiving on this lower resolution, and it actually ends up making the overall gaming experience really great. I would say that 720p is not out of the question in this game, and you're gonna have a really rock solid time if you're playing like this. So it's something to keep in mind, and I would really consider if you're looking to have a rock solid gaming experience here. And the 25-watt TDP might not even be necessary, because with the FreeSync display on this particular laptop, the level of performance that we're getting at just the stock 15-watt TDP was more than enough to be within the FreeSync range, so you would never see any screen tearing, and it would feel ultra smooth on the built-in display. This being above that pretty much means that FreeSync no longer works, so you're going to see screen tearing when you are above 60 hertz. Of course, if you are hooking this up to an external monitor, this extra level of performance is going to be nice, though nothing life-changing. But if you have the display in general, it's more than likely going to have a better response time anyway to the admittedly cheap IPS display that's built into this. IPS in general just has worse response times than anything like a TN panel or an IPS panel that was specifically designed to be for high refresh rate gaming. This being a cheap panel that is used on what is essentially meant to just be an office or school laptop, it's not exactly going to have the best response time for things like gaming. So even if you're in a situation where you want to do some gaming and you have a high refresh rate monitor and you can't exactly hit those numbers, you're still going to get an overall better gaming experience, because the response time of the panel is more than likely going to be better than the one in this laptop. So it's something to keep in mind there. So to round things out, we are looking at the 30-watt TDP running like this, and overall the performance gains that we're seeing are not substantial. This was pretty much in the same match that we were playing at the 25-watt TDP, and you can see that the overall level of performance that we're getting is pretty much identical for the most part. This area did end up being very, very demanding, so the performance levels that we were getting out of the 25-watt TDP were pretty much in this range here, so there wasn't really any noticeable gains, and overall the temperatures that we were getting just ended up going up. So I think that at 720p, it's probably for the best to just stick with the 25-watt TDP or the 15-watt TDP. It really just depends on how much you care about having performance that is as close to 60 and whether or not the increase of noise is going to bother you or not. I did play multiple games with the 30-watt TDP, so in general, the level of performance that we were getting was well within the range that we were getting for the 25-watt TDP. There was no real noticeable gains, even in the areas that were lighter. So I think at 720p, we're pretty much already kind of just tapping out in terms of the level of performance that we can squeeze out of here. And it does make sense because we are at this point mostly GPU bound in the sense that the CPU is really not going to net us much more gain here. And the temperatures that we were getting were kind of just pretty high up there. So in general, I would probably just stick to 900p or go down to 720p depending on how smooth of an experience you're trying to get. If you want to be essentially at a 60 FPS average, I would go down to 720p and either play at 15 watts and be within the FreeSync range of the display, or play at 25 watts and for the most part be within the range, though sometimes going above it, but in the more intense areas you're still going to be well within it, so FreeSync will end up working for you here. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe and I will see you in the next one.